Hello everyone, and welcome to this Challenge Poverty Week event and to the launch of the Joseph Rowntree Poverty in Scotland report. You know, as we sit here today, there's over 1 million people in Scotland living in poverty, a quarter of them children. So there's never been a more important and necessary time for us to come together and talk about how we challenge that. As you know, we'll hear later from both representatives from the Scottish and the UK governments about the significant powers that they have and what we can do to question that. And, you know, we can talk about whether envoys have a place in that, of course. We'll get into it in just a minute, but before we do, just a little bit of housekeeping. There's no fire alarms planned today, so if you do hear an alarm, follow the fire exit. Don't follow me, but I think there's Joseph Rowntree staff who can show you the right direction, and toilets, etc. in the foyer. For those who are not in the room with us, cameras and mics are off, but we will be taking questions later, so we'll come to you and make sure that you're able to join with the Q&A. So without further ado, I'd just like to pass across to Chris Burke, who leads on the work for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in Scotland, who's going to give you the quite shocking highlights and lowlights, should I say, of the latest report.
Thanks so much, Karen. Must apologise, I'm full of bogies, so I may sound like Tom Waits by the end of this, so I'll try and growl my way through this. But yeah, firstly, thank you and welcome to Challenge Poverty Week and to our launch of Poverty in Scotland 2024. Karen's already talked about some of the highlighted findings in the report, so I'm going to focus in on what the report does, which is our social security system. And in part of writing this report, one of the chapters is frankly a bit of a love letter to the social security system, and it includes this quote from the original Beveridge report. Because we sometimes hear discussions at the moment that somehow people are arguing that the social security system is topped out, it's done all it can do, there's no more it can or should do. Mince, and this report shows it. We need to acknowledge that the current state of the social security system is a result of political choices, whether they're budgetary or policy. But let's not kid ourselves that our work on social security is done. Because social security can do enormous good in our society. And these two graphs are two examples of it. I'm also slightly trolling my digital team here, but I've made a couple of edits to the very beautiful slides they've made. Is if you look at these arrows, which I have expertly drawn on, these show where change can and does happen. So the graph on the left shows what we think is the impact of the Scottish child payment. We are worried, if you can move the slides along, please. There you go. Click a couple of times, get my dodgy arrows up. Timing is everything in comedy. So the graph on the left shows what we are worried that the Scottish child payment isn't showing up in the official statistics. So what we've done is we've modelled what we think the impact is. So the green line shows you where we think child poverty will have gone, reduced by about 4 percentage points as a result of a £26.70 Scottish child payment. Welcome. And the other big red arrow on the other side is the fall in the poverty rate amongst people on the legacy benefits of the UK system. And again, these were positive choices by the UK government, things like working tax credits, child tax credits, big changes, big falls in poverty, but they do cost money. So the Scottish Government are spending the best part of 450 million quid on the Scottish child payment, and the IFS thought that Labour spent about an additional 18 billion a year to create these reductions. So they don't happen by osmosis. But as Beveridge said, the social security system there should be there to reduce want, but want is rife in our society. So our report finds social security is not keeping, social security is not keeping people out of poverty. Low-income families have become more reliant on income from work, but because of the withering of the social security system, poverty rates have not changed. Work First has failed to reduce poverty. Some families are systematically discriminated against by the social security system. I'll come back to that. There's a particularly harsh effects on disabled people and carers, and that the housing cost element of universal credit is failing to keep people out of poverty. And this is reflected in this quote from one of our brilliant End Poverty Scotland group who help us every year to write our report. I don't know anyone that's on benefits that feels secure, but you should feel secure. So why is that? Why is that insecurity? Shrinking benefits and a growth in work, poverty is largely unchanged. Sadly, our lead analyst, Carla Sabula, who's watching at home, did all the brilliant analysis in this, and has some very complicated graphs. I find it more difficult than her to describe, so bear with me. But all these graphs show the low-income groups within our society, and the different kind of blobs within them show how their income is made up. And what you see here, in the navy blue kind of increasing mountain at the bottom, that is the proportion of people's incomes which comes from work. So you'll see in each of these deciles, so 10% chunks of the population, it's increasing. And the green bit in the middle is the proportion of their income from Social Security. That's squeezing. So that's the effect. People's incomes in the lower end not increasing as quickly as those higher up, and Social Security income shrinking. Hence, no reduction in poverty. And part of that shrinking is that the value of low-income benefits has fallen in real terms over time. It's particularly striking for people without children. So you'll see here, single people in 2013-14, before so-called welfare reform, had an income of, after housing costs, that was 52% below the poverty line. It's now 64% below the poverty line. For couples, it's just as bad. But again, we have seen changes over time which have seen improvements. The £20 uplift during the COVID pandemic, which we know is gone, made a difference. For families with children, we see the Scottish Child Payment, we see child benefit helping to lift families' incomes. As I've said before, and we'll repeat ad nauseum, the work first approach of the UK government in particular has failed to reduce poverty. And so this is example families of people who are out of work. The pink dotted line is the poverty line. As you'll see, for almost all of these families, they have been in poverty over each of the last 10 years. But for families with children, you see both child benefit and the Scottish Child Payment boosting incomes. But again, you see the bump of the £20 uplift during the pandemic. That's gone. And after housing costs, the position is much worse. So for example, a single parent family, after housing costs, they will have an income 24% below the poverty line. So again, people struggling to get by. And work changes the position. So we have intentionally here chosen a large family, so a family with 3 or more children. So one baby, one toddler, and a child at school. And look at the dip in the middle. That, for those who know, is the 2-child limit kicking in. So families' incomes falling. And for those out of work, deeply in poverty. And again, you see child benefit and Scottish Child Payment trying to help. And then one person is in work, more likely to be out of poverty, but this is before housing costs. The situation is different after housing costs. And then with one person in full-time work and one person part-time, again, you see these quite flat incomes, but they are boosted. But as I say, it takes having both family members in work before these households would escape after housing cost poverty. And the policy decisions which are, skip on to the next slide, thanks. The policy decisions which are made impact more on certain types of households. So this graph here shows you in green the proportion of particular households who receive. We're in receipt of Social Security, so for single parents, almost all single parents, it's about 95%. For 3 or more children, for people with young children, where somebody is disabled, huge proportions of those types of households are in receipt of Social Security. So if Social Security goes down, these are the families who suffer. And in the navy blue lines, that shows you the proportion of their income from Social Security. So again, you see single parents, families where somebody is disabled, single people as well, showing high reliance on Social Security for their income. And things like the 2-child cap, if we skip on to the next slide, please. This again is another reflection for our End Poverty Scotland group. The 2-child cap is punishing children for having brothers or sisters. And I think for me, that's one of the, it's cruel in terms of its impact on people's incomes, but also the stigmatization which goes with it. the judgment that forces onto families. For me, that's almost the worst part of it. It's worth also looking at the position of disabled people and carers, people who are less likely to be able to access the labour market as much as other people. And often, disability payments are taught as if they're for somebody else. There are 300,000 people in Scotland in receipt of adult disability payments alone. I didn't have time to look up the child one and the older people. Lots of people. But disability benefits are supposed to cover the additional costs of being disabled, which, as anybody will understand, are numerous and different for every individual, etc. We know those payments struggle to keep up with those additional costs. What we've done is we've discounted those from families' incomes to see what the real effect is on families where somebody is disabled. And we find that 41% of people in families in receipt of disability benefits were in poverty. 41%, nearly twice the kind of average rates. And this is borne out in the fact that children and adults in those households are 3 times more likely to be in material deprivation. And they overlap with carers. These groups overlap with half of the families that receive carers allowance also in receipt of disability benefits, with 1 in 4 carers in poverty and 1 in 3 in carers allowance in poverty. And why it's so welcome that we have both the Scottish and the UK governments represented today is because they both have a massive role to play. And the UK government does still have the lion's share of powers over social security. But there are things to do for both governments and for governments to do together, to work together to make it easier for people to access what they're eligible for, and to rethink the interactions between things like Job Centre Plus and the devolved employability support. For the UK government, we'd all love to see them remove the most pernicious elements of universal credit, whether that's the 2-child limit, benefit cap, 5-week wait, etc. But also, as we've been campaigning with the Trussell Trust, build an income floor into universal credit as a first step to an essential guarantee. And the Scottish Government still have their child poverty targets bearing down on them, which we think we are going to miss the interim targets. How can a child payment be used more and targeted, but also look at the adequacy of disability payments? And I'll just leave you with this quote from one of our group. I wish the benefit system was separate from politics. It's so unfair that every time someone wants to stay in power, they want to be seen as coming down hard on people on benefits. Then everyone that's having to do it as a lifeline is screwed over. We can do better than that, and hopefully this report contributes towards us doing so. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Chris. And yeah, those, not only the stats, but that personal testimony that you hear in the report, I think is so striking. I'm really left with that feeling that Alex has, for example, about that lack of security that people are living with. And so we're delighted to welcome Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Shirley Ann Somerville, up to the front, who's going to give us some of our reactions to that. You've said that it's a defining mission for your government to end child poverty, and we're looking at disability and child poverty as 2 of these key things. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Hi there. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be able to be here with you and to have an opportunity to discuss the findings of this really important report. But can I begin my remarks today by thanking the members of the End Poverty Scotland group that I had the chance to spend a little bit of time with before we began events down here today. Once again, just a really, really important opportunity for me to speak directly to people and their experiences, both of the UK and of the Scottish social security system. So thank you very much for that, and I know that your findings and your thoughts play a large part in what the GRF are doing, and I can have assured them, and I would assure everybody in the room, they play a very large part in what the Scottish Government does too. Because the findings of this report are really, really a very stark reminder of the challenging situations that we find ourselves here in Scotland and indeed in the rest of the UK. And I'm really pleased to see the focus on social security as well. That important focus on the links between social security, poverty housing, and of course then how we fit that into employability and in the jobs market. Now, we have been very clear right from the start of the devolution of social security that social security is a human right. It is something which we need to remove the stigma from, and it's something that people should be supported and encouraged to apply, and then be supported and encouraged through that application process to get what they are entitled to. The discussions that we had right at the start of the devolution of our social security, and it is only 15% of social security, but the discussions that we had around there are really summed up in that strapline about dignity, fairness and respect. And my responsibility as Minister is to take that strapline and to turn that into the reality of how people are actually experiencing the devolved social security system. Now, I'm very pleased to read that there is much in the report about how what we have done within Scotland is showing a new way of doing social security. Chris is quite right. The aspects around social security are a choice. There are different ways of delivering social security, and I hope that we have demonstrated it can be done in a much more humane, understanding and supportive way. The report also quite rightly points out where we need to go further, or where the challenges are quite rightly made against the Scottish Government. Because although I am exceptionally proud of what we've done and what we've delivered, we are still a new system. We need to be open to learning, we need to be open to improvement, and we need to be able to do that by listening to the GRF and to those with the experience now of our current system to see how that still further needs to be developed. Now, as we look to the rollout beyond the benefits that we have, we know there is then an opportunity to look at how we deliver social security once that devolution is complete. And we know from speaking to people directly that there are still barriers that are there. The report mentions those from ethnic minority families and the fact that there is a much less of a proportion who are successful in achieving a benefit entitlement and also even from coming forward. We saw this in some of the recent work that Social Security Scotland did, and I heard firsthand when I went to Ibrox Primary recently about some of the barriers that the women that I spoke to there were facing. So again, how do we go further than what we have done already? Inclusive communications, work in different community languages is a good starting point, but we have to go and must go so much further. How do we ensure our system doesn't sit in an office, whether it's in High Street in Glasgow or even in our communities in Glasgow, but gets into Ibrox Primary, gets into where people are, gets into the people and the areas and the networks that they trust, to then build that trust with our social security system. There's a real need for us to continue to go further with that. And as we look at the impact of social security on tackling poverty, I'm very, very mindful that there is much more to do. We also know that it impacts on so many different aspects of people's lives. I've talked about housing as one of them. And Chris quite rightly pointed out to the challenge that the Scottish Government has set itself, and indeed the Parliament set the Government around our anti-poverty targets. Those are something which I'm acutely aware of, and I am still determined to meet those. We know we need to go further in the pace and the change on that, and that's what we want to see. Because missing the targets is not inevitable, and we know we need to go further and faster on that. But across the report, I was also struck on the emphasis of working across the two governments to ensure that the people get what they need. Now, I'll be honest, that was not something that was even remotely possible over the many years I've been in government so far. And the responsibility of both governments, and I am, and the rest of the Scottish Government is determined to play our part in reaching out to ensure that that opportunity is given to the UK Government for us to be able to genuinely work together. There is much talk of two governments within Scotland. This is the opportunity for those two governments to be able to work together. To, yes, listen to the challenges in this report, some for the UK Government, some for my government, But I think the biggest opportunity we have is, for the first time certainly that I've been in elected office, for those two governments to actually work side by side. Now, time will tell how successful we are in that, and we need to be held to account, both governments, for how that goes on. I think this report is a very, very good starting point to allow the government to do that, and I'm certainly hoping that the UK government is in the same mindset, and we're both willing to rise to that occasion that you've presented us with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, and ending on a note of hope there. So we're going to go across now to Ian Murray MP, Secretary of State, who is with us. Yeah, great, thank you. And to hear from him, Ian, you've been listening to the findings of that report. Tell us, what are your initial impressions there, and how do we respond so that two governments are working together?
Great. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm sorry I'm not with you in person. It's our first day back at school, as you could say today, in terms of Parliament resitting. So after the conference recess, so apologies to have to zoom in. But thank you very much for the invite to come along, because I think it's a really important report and the opportunity to outline some of the steps that the new UK Labour government is taking to reduce poverty in Scotland and, of course, across the whole of the UK. And maybe to respond directly to Shirley-Anne from her initial comments in terms of working together, the Prime Minister and the First Minister have made it their key policy objective to reset the relationship. That message has gone to all Secretaries of State and indeed, as I understand it, to all Cabinet Secretaries and Ministers in both governments to make sure we're working together. And I hope that Shirley-Anne's had a really good relationship so far, working relationship so far with her counterpart at both DWP and other departments that are overlapping in terms of social security. So we'll continue to work together to reset that relationship, because your report highlights how important it is for where things are devolved and reserved to make sure we can deliver on behalf of the people that we all seek to represent in Scotland. And that's the only guiding principle in terms of the way we want to work as a new government. I think that the report, and thank you for it, I think it's really important to see the context of that report. I think that when you look at some of those graphs and you see the lines on some of those graphs, it's quite clearly what has happened and where it's happened. And can I just also thank all the organisations that are present either on the call or in the room who've been engaging with us already in terms of the way in which we've been trying to develop policy. I've spent a lot of time with Poverty Alliance and Cyrenians, etc., to get what's happening on the ground and to try and understand fully the complexities of what's happening here in the system. And I think having 1 million people in poverty and a quarter of those in children is really sobering. But I think the most sobering thing is that none of us are surprised. And that really should be the thing that we need to tackle in terms of where we are in terms of policy. There's a lot to say, indeed, but we are only 95 days into this new government, and I hope that the organisations present and the sector has seen that we've already done a lot of engagement in the way in which we want to work to try and make sure we can develop these policies, whether it be in social security or indeed the much wider matrix of stuff that has to be done in terms of the underlying parts of poverty. We will have our budget on the 30th of October. The Chancellor has been pretty clear on two things. One is the inheritance that we've got to try and deal with. And I think when you look at some of those graphs that were presented at the start and see where the lines started to move, that inheritance is pretty stark. We will deal with that inheritance as quickly as we possibly can in order to be able to develop the policies that were in our manifesto, particularly around social security and the other matrices of poverty. But also, the Chancellor has been pretty clear that those with the broadest shoulders will carry the majority of what needs to be done to reset our economy and to try and get us back onto a track of where we can grow the economy for all nations and regions and parts of our country, which is really quite important. It's also worth saying as well that when you see those graphs, reducing poverty across all sections of society, particularly child poverty, is in our party's DNA. We did it before. Unfortunately, we're going to have to do it again. We didn't think we would have to. We wanted to halve poverty in the time we were in office before. We thought it might have been eradicated by now, but actually it's got worse, and all of that progress has pretty much all been reversed. So we didn't want to have to reduce poverty again in government, but we are going to have to do that because of the way in which things have worked out. And I was reflecting on your report last year in terms of, is work working? And that was all part of helping us develop as well our policy on in-work pay. We still see, and again, the graphs in the presentation earlier on shows that in-work poverty is a real scourge, and how do we resolve that? And we'll be publishing our employment rights bill later this week. We'd promised to try and get that bill published within 100 days. We will make that target by the end of this week. And that's to fundamentally transform work and pay, and it's to make work pay in terms of the overall strategy. So it will ban exploitative zero-hours contracts, it will outlaw fire and rehire, it will make sure that the national minimum wage, which is a real success story in terms of becoming part of the political fabric now, nobody argues against the national minimum wage, but that becomes a genuine living wage, and people get paid rightly for a good day's work. And it's still sobering that 2/3 of children in poverty are in households where one or both adults are working full-time. And that means that there's a big problem in their economy, and a big problem with pay. And we hope that our new deal for working people in terms of making work pay will start to resolve some of those big issues, and we'll have that bill published by the end of this week. And I think it's also important to highlight the tackling of universal credit in terms of our full review. It was mentioned there at the start that universal credit was one of the key drivers in terms of the social security system, of how you can help and support people in the system, and that's really important. Our full review of universal credit has already kicked off, and that will look at all aspects of it, everything from the 2-child cap all the way through to housing allowances and all those other issues that are a component of universal credit. We've also started a child poverty task force that's chaired jointly by the Secretaries of State for Education and the Department of Work and Pensions. That's looking at how you tackle all the other big issues that are around in terms of poverty. Yes, it's about the social security system, universal credit, but it's about housing, it's about educational attainment, it's about health inequalities. It's about pay in the workplace, it's about progression in skills, it's about those underlying causes of poverty that are inherent in our society that we need to try and find a way of resolving once and for all. And if we can drive that from the bottom, then we should be able to see some marked figures in terms of poverty as we go forward through the next few years. I know myself that, being a Western Hills lad and growing up in a council estate, that having that security of tenure in terms of a house was the bedrock on which the family was built. And without having that security of tenure, it's really, really difficult to see how you can get yourself out of poverty and on a much more positive path without having housing as being one of the key drivers. And I know that both governments are working very closely together with housing being devolved, but we're working to make sure that we can get those houses in place, we can get social and council housing in place, and we can resolve the housing emergency that we've declared both in Scotland and indeed across a lot of our individual local authorities. I think it's also maybe just worth saying as well about the manifesto commitments we've got in housing, whether it be in childcare and education and work, and all of those things. We want to see that through. We've made a good start over the last 95 days. There'll obviously be big bumps along the road because these are big fundamental challenges for us to be able to try and cope with. But the whole culture of the new government is to try and resolve these issues, and we're determined to do so. And I'm struck by those graphs, that with the dates on the bottom of those graphs, exactly what's happened. When you tinker with a social security system that's been tinkered with in order to try and resolve a budget rather than to try and help people either into work or into a much more secure life, then that's what happens with the graphs. They go in an adverse direction, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen again. I'm surely Anne and I will disagree. We've exchanged letters already on things that we are concerned about, and we'll continue to obviously exchange letters to do that, and that's the right thing for us to do. But that joint working is really, really important in this area. In fact, we have a Scotland Office order on Wednesday of this week on attendance allowance. It was part of the 2016 Scotland Act in terms of devolution of social security. That's coming through on Wednesday to fully make sure that's fully devolved and operational. So there's lots of stuff going on to make sure the system works better, and we want to make sure the system can work better. There's no reason why Social Security Scotland and the DWP can't work jointly in terms of the delivery of social security to make sure that we get the best of both systems for the benefit of everyone who needs to access that system. And I suppose finally, just in terms of where we are with trying to get people to access the system. I was really struck in the report by ethnic minority communities who seem to be excluded. Finding out how you get to excluded communities is probably the biggest challenge of any elected member. Surely Anna will be exactly the same as me as a local elected member. I don't worry about the people that are contacting us directly. I worry about the people behind closed doors who are not seeking help and how we access those. And that's a huge challenge, not just for the system, but for elected members, services such as Citizens Advice and other places who are able to get to people to give them what they deserve to be able to claim and help them navigate their way through the system. And I think that's a huge challenge for us, not just finding those individuals and families, but actually being able to engage with them and then get them what they deserve to be claiming. And that's a huge battle for us all to try and work together to try and resolve. So I suppose just finally, the Scotland office here, we are fully engaged in this agenda. We've got 4 big priorities as a new government and as a Scotland office. It's growth being the #1 priority, but that feeds into our green agenda, which is our second priority. Our third one being Brand Scotland, to try and increase our exports, to improve our businesses and create more jobs and more highly skilled jobs. And of course, the fourth one, which is attached to the first 3, is the eradication of poverty. And that's something that myself and my Minister of State, Kirsty McNeill, the new MP for Midlothian, are fundamentally committed to doing. And we can only do that by all of us, whether it be devolved governments, UK government, organisations like JFR, etc., to working together to try and find ways of which we can not only make the system work better, but make sure that those that are requiring to access the system get access to that system and get the funds and the support that they deserve. But there's a huge amount of work to be done, and this report gives us that very sobering starting point of looking at those figures to show that we need to make sure that all of those graphs that we've seen in that initial presentation turn the other way, and turn the other way pretty quickly. Thanks very much indeed.
And the idea, I think, was that we're going to be rejoined by Ian for a chat with Shirley Ann Somerville, and here he is. So I've been briefed as a journalist that this is a fireside chat, so I'm glad that Ian is joining us by the virtual fireside rather than kind of down the chimney or something over here. So thank you for both of your reflections on that. I think what we'd like to do now is just, kind of dig into that a little bit more and see what that really means in practice. The first point that both of you have talked about is one of the main points of this report is about the importance of the Scottish and UK governments working closely together, because the people who were working on this report with experience of poverty told researchers that really what they were finding was that they were falling down the gaps between the two systems. It was really complex to navigate. So really a question for both of you: what more can we do to make those systems easy, straightforward to navigate? And how do we make sure, as you've both pointed out, as many people as possible who have the right to access benefits, who have the right not to be left in poverty, are able to do so? Can I come to you first, Shirley Ann?
Yeah, so this is a really important point, and it's something that we're going to have to get better at, because I now hope, as I said in my remarks, we've got another government who is willing to come on that journey with us. If I can give one example about a partnership that's been running in a part of Dundee recently, one of our pathfinders, where actually amongst that community we had all different agencies, different public services come together, including the DWP. Now, it was remarked at the time that that was quite unusual, and the hint was rather made to me when I went up to visit it, that it was kind of because the DWP were doing it a bit underneath the radar, a bit just trying to make sure they were doing it in Dundee. We need to make sure that the message is coming down from the Secretary of State all the way through, that's actually how we should be working. So as we look to broaden out our Fairer Future partnerships, which we've done in the programme for government, which will be about delivering services, then how do we also include the things that are still reserved? Because the point is always made to me quite rightly when we speak to people is, it's not an individual's responsibility to sit there and work out whether the benefit's reserved, or whether it's devolved, or whether it's something for a local government person to do. That is not their problem. That is our problem. And we have created a system with devolution social security that is more complex. I would argue it was the right thing to do and it's been successful, but we still have made the system more complex. So I give the example up in Dundee that it can be done, and it can be done in a different way together. One of the other key challenges and ways that we can prove how we'll do this differently is obviously the UK government has already announced changes to Job Centre Plus and how that's working. That's got to link in with employability and the aspects of that that are devolved. So we cannot have a system being set up that just looks at how that works at a UK level or at a kind of English level and takes no cognizance of what's happening in Scotland. Nor can that be done at the end where we get, oh, this is what we've came up with, how does that work for you guys? Well, probably it doesn't if that's where we're coming in. And the key for all of that is not just speaking to the Scottish Government, but by speaking to the people who actually receive those services. So there's a real first big test, I think, for the UK Government to be able to demonstrate that it can deliver that system change, which is needed, but do it in a way where they're actually doing that jointly with the Scottish Government rather than what we've had in the past under the previous government, where we've kind of been given a big dada moment and told how this is going to work, and actually it doesn't work.
Fantastic, thank you. And Ian Murray, you've already said that there will be areas where you disagree. There's been some letters exchanged. We can come back to that. But what are your thoughts on that and how we make sure that the two governments are working together, that the experience for the person at the heart of this is as good as possible? Yeah,
I mean, and ultimately we want to get to a one-stop shop where the individual is the centre of it rather than it being who delivers the benefit, because surely Anne's right, actually, it's not just about both governments. Councils deliver welfare benefits as well, other organisations too. So we've got to make sure that we can get that one-stop shop for people so they know seamlessly how they can claim that, and that's the challenge. And, you know, the issue is cultural, I think, from a DWP level, and I hope that culture's either changed or starting to change, because the Secretary of State is pretty clear that in terms of the devolved issues, all the levers we have to pull to improve our poverty statistics are based on reserved and devolved powers, and we have to pull them together. And without pulling them together, we just end up in the situation we've been in for the last decade and a half or so, where it seems a very adversarial relationship, and the people who lose out are the people who are requiring the support of both governments the most. So there's that big cultural thing that we have to do. There's also just about an information thing. And again, I think it might be a cultural thing. The ethnic minority issues that you've raised may be cultural. Also, we've put a huge drive in over the last 60 days to improve the take-up of pension credit, and it's up 175%. So, you know, governments need to work together to make sure people know they're entitled to stuff as well. I know Age Scotland have a helpline, a maximising income helpline that is very, very popular. I've sat on and listened to some of those calls, and people do just ring up and say, look, I was just wondering if I'm entitled to X, Y, or Z, and they tend to be successful. So it's trying to get the information out that the system isn't impenetrable, that there are people out there that can help, and that we can work seamlessly together to make that happen. I believe there's discussions going on at the moment about a new data sharing agreement between both governments so that can be best delivered. And also, I think there maybe has to just be another, again, cultural shift, that we have to syringe the politics out of the social security system, and maybe we need to decide and discuss what is the best place for the organisations to deliver, who is best placed to deliver benefits and social security payments, because during COVID it worked incredibly well when local authorities were much more localised, because they could get to people quicker and they knew how best to deliver support. So I think there's a much wider discussion about where things are best delivered in order for it to be much more amenable to the public, but also much more accessible. And I don't know the answers to those questions, but I think they're really worth having if we really want to try and change the culture of what social security is about and supporting those that are most in need.
Fantastic. And yeah, obviously there's been some coverage of the recent problem with data sharing, which is in this morning's Times, about the data not being passed. So maybe someone wants to pick that up in a question at a later date. I just want to come on to the importance of work as well, and what the findings in the report are about the importance of work, but the fact that that work first kind of situation is not really working. And I want to ask you about how we make sure that we avoid the kind of past mistakes of that work first being kind of all, and the stigmatisation of that, and how we avoid the stigmatisation of that. Ian, do you want to give me your thoughts on that, as you know, there's been lots of headlines about the importance of work, and as you say, your policy later this week. Got you. Shall we take Shirley Ann Somerville? Do you want to speak to that first, if there's a problem?
Yeah. So it is very important that we have a change of approach from the UK government on this. And there's been some signs of that from the new Secretary of State for the DWP. There's also been some areas where she's had discussions where I'm still slightly quite uncomfortable by some of the language and the tone of that. But let's see how that develops, because we do need to see a radical change from what's happened. I don't need to tell anybody in the room or online, we know sanctions don't work. There's evidence for years and years and years that sanctions do not work for people. So there's a very simple thing that I don't think needs a review as part of the universal credit, because we know that. That's an accepted understanding of it, and that political choice that the previous government made to keep sanctions was a political choice, because it wasn't based on evidence. So if we can get rid of aspects like that, which will never form part of a social security system that's devolved to the Scottish Government, we start then changing the discussion around social security and work, and we take away the stigma that people feel. One of the biggest frustrations I have as someone who deeply believes that social security is an investment in people and it is a human right, is the stigma that's still faced by people. And we'll do what we can to change that up here, but when you've got 85% of that system still reserved, that's enormously important. Because if we can get away from sanctions, and if we can get away from people being fearful about approaching a job centre or their work coach, and actually they can have an honest discussion about what they feel able to do, what they want to be supported to achieve in the future, then we get much more out of a system. And quite frankly, it's better for the individual, both in terms of their own self-respect and their place in society, but it actually just works full stop in terms of hopefully getting people closer to the labour market. So if we can do that, if we can change the way that those systems are developed, like we're trying to do in employability that's devolved to Scotland, then we stand a much better chance of supporting people into work. Then you genuinely get people going, it's not work first, but it's the right work for them, and that they can approach the labour market in a way that gives them more confidence that if it's not working for them, they will be supported to find something that is, rather than punished as the system currently is.
Fantastic. We can talk a lot more about employability and the various aspects with that. Ian, are you able to hear us now? Do sanctions work?
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Yeah,
do sanctions work, and how do we destigmatise?
Huge issue of our time, because it's not just the input to work that's really important, but it's actually making work pay and its associations with the system itself. So, you know, we've put a lot of emphasis as a government onto making sure that people who do wish to work and want to work are able to get into work and have that support. But it's not just about the physical transfer into work and that support. It's about skills, it's about reskilling, it's about lifetime skilling, it's about transport costs, of course. Childcare is a big part of this, the education system. So there's a huge plethora of things that have to be changed and done in order to make sure the pathway into work is as smooth as possible for the people who are able to do so. And then, of course, when you're in work, you need that safety and security as part of it, and that's what our New Deal for Working People is trying to achieve. It's not just about making sure people are in work, make sure they get a decent day's pay for a decent day's work. They're able to support their families on that. And I've always found it extraordinary. I mean, working tax credits have been a huge success story, again, referring back to your graphs, of a government intervention to support pay in the workplace. But actually, if you think about that in terms of the principle of it, it's essentially subsidising employers to pay poor wages in order to make sure that people can get the pay they require to be able to support their own lifestyles and their families. So there's a huge circular argument here about government intervention to make sure work actually pays properly, and that's what our entire employment rights bill that will be published this week is about, is to make sure that happens. So that if you then crack that particular nut, it makes the association with the welfare system much, much easier. And of course, it means that you're able to fill the skills gaps that you have in the economy as well, which improves economies. And every single penny in terms of welfare spend and in terms of people who are particularly in the lower end of income scales are spent locally, and that helps local economies massively as well. So there's this circle we're trying very much to crack, and hopefully some of the policies that we've already put in place will help us to do so.
Thank you very much for joining us, Ian Murray. I'm sure there could be other questions for Ian, but unfortunately I think you're having to leave us at this point. So we're delighted to welcome up, re-welcome Chris Burt, who's joined by Peter Kelly from the Poverty Alliance. If you could come up. Thank you for joining us, Ian. And now we're just going to take some questions from the floor. There's going to be some mics coming round. If you could just wait until you've got the mics so that we can hear your question loud and clear. We don't have very long for questions, I'm afraid, so if you could keep them quite brief, and we'll take whoever is most suited to the answer. There's also the questions being taken online. We've got someone up at the middle front here.
Hi, good morning. My name is David Cairns. I work with the Alexandra Rose Charity and Glasgow Community Food Markets. I actually graduated from Strathclyde a long time ago, and I worked for Marks and Spencer's applying statistics to the food and drinks department. So I know a little bit about the graphs that we've been looking at today. 2007, I became one of these people with lived experience of poverty, and I've worked with the Poverty Alliance and quite a few other organisations like that. What I've learned over the years, worked with the Scottish Government on the Food and Drink Commission, which is beginning to reap some dividends and hopefully make a real difference to people living in poverty, helping them to access healthy food. I really hope, Shirley, that you can encourage your colleagues to enshrine the right to food as a basic human right. Social Security Scotland at the moment isn't fit for purpose, and I'm not wanting a debate about that. It's just, I've got letters from your chief executive admitting that, but we have to work together. I hope you really can work with Ian and your colleagues and other political parties, because in my opinion, in the 20 years that I've been doing this, party politics aren't working for people living in poverty. And if you do, and I do believe your intention, work together with your other colleagues and other political parties, then we can begin to address poverty in Scotland. I've got Joseph Rowntree report from 2016, Poverty Alliance report from 2015, that they're all very well intentioned, but here we are again, and nothing seems to change. The only real recommendation I would make with respect is listen to people in communities. We don't need another commission. We don't need other reports into poverty. You need to go into communities, listen to what people in these communities need and want, and act on that. There's not one solution that will address poverty in Scotland.
Thank you very much. I'll bring that back to the panel, David. Can I have another question? Is there another question? And we'll bring all of these points to the panel. We've got one sitting right next to David. We've got one at the back.
Mr. Johnson, SAFA, the Armed Forces Charity. You mentioned, Shirley-Ann, that 15% of Social Security is devolved, to Scotland. If you had your ideal day, what else would you like devolve? And don't say the other 85%. What was your quick win in that case?
Okay, so we've got a quick win. Let's have the quick win first, and then let's take some of those points around its fitness for purpose, and the fact that we're still here talking about it year after year. But let's have a quick win first.
The quick win would be the changes you could make to universal credit without doing a review, because we know it doesn't work already. So the two-child cap, the benefit cap, and let's just call the two-child cap what it is. It's the rape clause. So that's it should have no place in society. So there are a number of ways that you see could be changed. The under 26 aspect to the age discrimination that's built into the system would be another one. So those were the things that I don't think, tying into David's point, that you need a review for. We know it's broken. David, if you can, I'm going to stay here for this part of the debate, but then I have to go to other meetings. But I do have other officials here. Please, if you could reach out today and let them know about the letters and that you're not happy with, because I had a discussion before I came down here, as I mentioned in my remarks, about the fact that I'm really proud of what Social Security Scotland have done, but we are new and we are learning and we need to be open to continuous improvement, and where the system's not working, I want to know about it so that I can fix it. So if we can, because we'll not get into it just now, please try and reach out, and if we can't manage that, let's figure out a way between us that we can do that. I get why you're sceptical. I get how you feel nothing's changed, but there were points in the graphs that Chris had there that shows that you can make change, whether it's with the £20 upright in UC, so if you actually had UC at an adequate level, there's another thing that could just be done, Alistair, as well. If there was a choice on that could be done with UC, if you deal with those aspects, and if you saw the difference the Scottish Child Payment can make, we can make a difference. We are making a difference in part. It's just it's not fast enough, and it's not in enough parts of our society. But I would take your point. The challenge is right. We don't need reviews and reports. We need to get on with some of that. And I feel that challenge, and I hope Ian does as well from his point of view.
I can just get your response to that. Not fit for purpose. We're here. We're not making enough change. We're not hearing enough from people in communities. We're not seeing enough people from different communities in this room, for example, on this panel. Talk to me about that.
I think you look at the evidence that Joseph Rowntree Foundation are presenting to us in this report today, and it's really hard to disagree and say that we're not making change. But I think also to Shirley Ann's point, we are seeing change, and we do need to constantly go back and look at what works and revise our understanding of where change is taking place, because I do believe that we've seen enormous change in the nature of poverty and some of the challenges that we face. And 20 years ago, we weren't facing quite the same challenges around digital exclusion. We didn't have a digital-first approach to our social security system. So the problems of poverty are dynamic and are changing. But what we don't do, and what I think we don't do enough of, is go to the heart of some of the causes of the problems. And I think throughout the JRF report, what you see is a problem of inadequacy. You see a problem of a failure to really address the problem of inadequate social security benefits at the UK level. And I think, again, and I'm not just saying this because Shirley Ann's here with us, but I think we've seen with the Scottish Child Payment where the Scottish Government has made real efforts to look at the level of that payment and begin to really increase it quite quickly. I think they need to go further than that, and we know that. So I think we can see where change is taking place. We can absolutely see where the pace of change is nowhere near sufficient, and we need to redouble our efforts. But I think we need to focus on some of those key issues, and as I said, the report helps us do that by focusing on the importance of the adequacy of social security.
Come to Chris. Is there one more question that we can take? We've got the woman at the front here, and we've got another woman. Can we take two very quick questions? Do we have time for that? Will they have to be very, very quick, apparently? Sorry, guys.
Thank you so much. Irina Zamorova here from Sustainability Charity Stiffer. I was wondering, Scottish Government published last week, 2 weeks ago, the National Climate Change Adaptation Plan, and we know that climate change is going to hit people living in poverty the worst. So I was wondering to what extent it is on your current agendas at the moment, thinking about housing, thinking about access to food and fuel. Thank you.
And
Emma Jackson, Citizens Advice Scotland. I was wondering, as the UK government carries out this work to review universal credit, what they might be able to learn from the values-based approach that we've taken to Social Security Scotland, and how that values-based approach might deal with, Chris, what you described as the systematic discrimination of key groups, and how we really target those if we're really truly going to lift people out of poverty.
so two really important points, one around the intersectionality of climate change and the climate crisis. Don't know if who wants to take that, who feels...
So, in terms of what the UK government can learn from Scottish Government, I think there's a lot. First, they need to be very clear that they are going to ditch some of the proposals that were out for consultation from the previous government around work capability assessments and that. That just needs to go, and they just need to be clear that that's not happening. We've said very clearly that we're happy to share the work that we've done about how we are processing, how we are working, how the whole system is set up to see what can be learned, because I think what we've demonstrated is you can run a system in a completely different way, still have robust decision making, but you run it in a humane fashion in the process. So I think if they're up for that, we are certainly up, and we've made that invite to the last government as well. Funnily enough, they didn't take it up, but hopefully the current government will. And the point around climate change is really important. I see a lot of things where it makes an immediate link about, to tackle climate change will help target poverty. It won't necessarily, unless you have smart policies in that allow you to do both. And I think that's where we've got to make sure that across government, as we try to tackle the climate emergency, we're doing so in a way that actually helps the poorest in our society at the same time. The two aren't mutually exclusive, but you can maybe do one policy that doesn't impact on the climate or vice versa. So we just need to do that policy development in a smart way.
And Chris, do you have any points on that?
Just very quickly on Emma's point about the sort of discrimination within the system. Some of it's just blatantly obvious. Like a two-child limit is obviously discriminating against particular families. Like it's not subtle. But there are more subtle things, which I'm glad both Shirley-Ann and Ian reflected on the huge drop, I should have mentioned in my presentation, huge drop in the proportion of people from minority ethnic backgrounds who are in receipt of Social Security over the last 10 or 20 years. Now, there might be a variety of explanations of that. So that's something we'd be keen to get into. But there's obviously something indirect within the system which is causing that to happen. Those are exactly the kind of things that we need to get into.
Thank you so much for your questions. I know there's so many, and there's so many I have as well, but Joseph Rowntree have promised to create some sort of fact sheet that's going to answer some of the questions that have come in online. Please direct other ones to them so that they can include them on there. But I'd just like to pass over to Peter Kelly now and just pull together some of the thoughts as we leave this really quite kind of important discussion, which feels like we've really only touched the absolute surface of, and we need to continue to do so throughout the week, I would imagine.
Thanks, Karen. You've set me up very well there to say just how do we continue this discussion, because I think Joseph Rowntree have kicked off Challenge Poverty Week in a really important and effective way by really, as I said earlier, focusing down on this issue, on the importance of social security as part of the solution to how we address poverty. And we've heard, I think, an awful lot over the last couple of months in particular about the difficult choices that governments have to make. We've heard from Scottish Government, but also particularly from UK Government, about the very difficult choices that politicians face. And I think when they're making those choices, when they're making those difficult choices, they need to consider the people who are living on low incomes, who are making those difficult choices day in and day out. And I think it would be good to reflect not just on the statistics that we've seen presented to us today in the report, but also the voices that we've heard. And Shirley-Ann met with some of the people from End Poverty Scotland earlier. I think it is those voices that are so important that we really need to reflect on the difficult choices that people are making every day. So politicians have the chance to ease the pressure that too many people are currently facing. But that needs a different approach to some key areas of policy. And during Challenge Poverty Week this week, there's an opportunity for us to highlight not only why different choices need to be made, so not only to reflect on the evidence and to discuss how big the problems are that we face, which we sometimes are perhaps a wee bit too focused on, but what are some of the solutions? What are some of the different approaches that we need to take? During this week, we've identified key policy priority areas, so around housing, adequate incomes, food, transport, and support for volunteers in the third sector. Those are all vitally important areas, and during this week, there'll be hundreds of events taking place right across the country where organisations are going to talk about not only those issues, but many more besides that, about how we can do things differently to challenge the injustice of poverty. So I would encourage you to try and get along to as many of those events as possible. A lot of them are online. You will learn, you will reflect, and you'll think maybe about how we do things differently. Challenge Poverty Week, I think, is at its heart an important opportunity to highlight not just what's going on this week, but the work that goes on throughout the year by organisations to tackle poverty. And it might be just 1 week, but it reflects that action and the support that takes place in communities every week of the year. It's a chance for us to press for more change, to hold governments to account, and I think vitally it's about strengthening our connections between each other, between organisations, building solidarity across civil society. And I think that solidarity is essential to create the kind of hope that we need for change. Shirley-Ann finished her comments earlier with a note of hope, and I hope that we can do that through this week. So during this week, take the chance to connect so that we can create not only the hope for change, but some of the action that we need to make Scotland free from poverty. I'd like to finally thank both the Robertson Trust and Joseph Rowntree Foundation for supporting Challenge Poverty Week, but also for Shirley-Ann Somerville and for Ian Murray for spending the time with us this morning to kick off this week. And I hope, as I say, that you can all take part in many events and really push this agenda forward. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thanks. Thank you. And that brings us to a close for now. Thank you so much for all coming along. And yeah, please do get out, see as many of the events as possible. Yeah, feel hopeful, but push for that change. And thank you very much. Cheers.